on YouTube. Now we are.
Yes. Alrighty. Hello to everyone who might be out there watching. Thank you for joining us for All About Horror Comics. I am here with guest Luke for this discussion on horror. Luke, why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, I am Luke Herr. I am a comics writer and editor. I mostly go online as Coltreg, Koltreg. I'm only on Blue Sky now, and uh, uh, yeah, I've ended up writing a few horror comics in like the past while. I think we had like 3 new ones drop this year, and so I am the person who was brought on to also talk with you about horror.
Awesome. And I will also go ahead and introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. Um, my name is AJ, or you may also know me as Anya, but I usually go by AJ Easterday online. I am a comic creator and editor. I run a small press called Easterday Editorial that specializes in comics anthologies. And I am also the new Columbus Cartoon Coalition live stream manager. So this is my first time hosting a live stream. So if there are any technical difficulties, do bear with me because it's my first time doing this by myself. And I am also a big horror fanatic, which is part of why I chose this topic. And of course, it is very fitting for the season as it's October, it's almost Halloween. And I don't know about any of you out there, but I know that as soon as fall hits, I am ready to read all of dark, creepy stuff. All right, so I've prepared some questions to kind of guide our discussion, and I know I got a few questions ahead of time from one of our group members, so we'll also make sure to answer those before the end of the day today. But I want to start with, of course, the most important question if you're going to start with horror, talk about horror comics, is how would you define horror?
I was thinking about this earlier today to kind of like get ready because there's horror elements like kind of your classic monsters that you can put into a story, but those don't necessarily make something into a horror story. And so I kind of feel like the definition of a horror story would be something whose main goal is to kind of induce fear that comes out of not knowing something.
That, I think, is a really good way of putting it. It is a pretty hard genre to define, in my opinion. But I think you got to the core of it is horror is about fear and kind of eliciting some kind of fear. And there's different levels of that as well, because some horror is just kind of like weird and unsettling. And then some is like full out makes you want to like scream. So there's all sorts of different kinds of horror. Um, and I'm glad you kind of brought up that there's certain like elements that are common to horror, but don't necessarily have to be in horror. Things like monsters, other paranormal activity is an example of that. And that actually leads very well into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is different horror tropes and conventions. So let's start with the good stuff. What are some of your favorite horror tropes and conventions?
Uh, I mean, I do love a good zombie like story, and I think they're one of those things where you can just toss zombies into something and have what would loosely be defined as horror, but I think that's kind of verging on that line where what makes a zombie scary is not necessarily what used to work, and kind of you need to have something more than just, oh well, we're putting zombies into a story and it's a horror comic and we're calling it a day. uh the kind of gothic horror, I think, where it's sort of not necessarily what is just happening now, but it's this legacy of what has come before that is the source of fear. It's either cultural mores or things that have happened in the past and kind of how those still influence us today. Like those are some big ones. And then I do love just the slasher. I mean, it's a formula. It is something that's clean. It is planned. It has ways that it works, and that allows you to work with it and invert ideas. What about you?
Well, thank you for asking. And I'm glad you kind of mentioned slashers because that's a very common horror subgenre that I want to get into again a little later. Um, I myself, I also really like monsters in horror, but um, I kind of am gonna add a caveat of like I like when the monster kind of stands for something. Like when you could watch a horror and be like, oh, this isn't your typical monster movie. This monster represents trauma, represents grief.
Mhm.
Um, in the case of like Godzilla, it was about like fear of like nuclear power. And nuclear weapons, which I think is very fascinating. So I like using monsters and things along that same vein to explore deeper subjects. Um, I also like alien stories for the same reason. I know aliens aren't always a big horror thing, they're more associated with sci fi, but like
Mhm.
the movie Alien is a sci fi horror. Um, and I like using non-human things as a way of like exploring the human condition. I think that's pretty cool. Um,
Well, if you don't mind me like kind of diverting for a moment, like
yeah,
I think you had mentioned Alien, like the Ridley Scott film specifically, and I think the reason why it works as horror is ultimately you aren't necessarily learning anything. It is kind of a slasher film in many ways where you're learning the rules, you're learning how it works, and it is something that you can't do anything against, and that's like how you get that crossover.
yeah. I think that's very true. It does feel like a slasher, but with like an alien as the villain. And I think what makes fun talking about like monsters and aliens when we apply it to comics specifically is then you get to practice your creature design. And I think that's a super fun skill to practice. And it's great to both study other comics and also like study horror movies can also be a good resource for like cool creature design. Um, as far as like other horror tropes, I've recently been getting into like a little bit of body horror. Um, and I used to like not like body horror at all. I thought it was the absolute worst. um, but actually reading the manga of the horror master Junji Ito is kind of what changed my mind on it. Um, and I will bring up Junji Ito, I'm sure, multiple times this session because you can't talk about horror comics without talking about Junji Ito. He's definitely one of the masters. Sorry, I see someone in our comments who is also a Junji Ito fan. That's great. Um, all right. So, well, we talked about horror tropes that we love, but I think when you're writing horror, it's also important, or really writing any genre story, it's also important to be aware of like the tropes that are maybe overdone. Sometimes they're a bit problematic or harmful, and that you should maybe steer away from. So, now let's talk about those. Are there any tropes that you think are overdone, you're tired of seeing, or you just don't like them?
I mean, if nothing else, there's a lot of kind of intrinsic sexism that is built into things. Like I did mention the slasher specifically, and that is very rooted in gender tropes from like the final girl as a concept where there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but it's easy to kind of go into, well, this character gets to live because she didn't have sex and she's still pristine and a virgin, and that's messed up. Um, like that, I think is one of the biggest ones. And then, like, kind of using, uh, using horror as a way to discuss mental illness in a way where it doesn't really discuss anything or look at things, and it is purely a way to vilify or other.
Yes. So you actually brought up some points that I was going to say. I think one of the most problematic tropes is definitely villainizing mental illness. There are definitely ways where you can talk about mental illness and various like health issues in horror and do it in a way that is respectful, in a way that's more exploratory. But if you purposely make the only character with a mental illness the villain and also make the reason for them doing their evil deeds because they have a mental illness, that's definitely going to come off as problematic.
Yeah.
And it's just overdone at this point.
Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have anything to say other than this makes you uncomfortable or worried. Why not explore those feelings? Why does that not make you necessarily the monster for refusing to kind of see how a person experiencing something different makes them feel like the outsider?
Yes, exactly. And then I also wanted to go back to what you were talking about with slashers, because talking about horror tropes that I hate, I'm going to be honest. I'm not as big a fan of the slasher subgenre, because I do think it is a genre that's kind of been done to death. However, I still will enjoy a slasher here or there if there is something that kind of subverts it. I mean, we already gave the example of Alien, how that kind of follows the structure of a slasher, but the villain is a creepy alien, and that automatically makes it cooler, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And I also want to bring up that you said there is like an element of sexism, and there's that trope that often comes up in slashers where it's the characters who have sex that always die. I am definitely not a fan of that trope. It just feels very like old fashioned. Like I'm
Puritanical.
like you, yeah, like why are we still doing that?
Mm-hmm. And
um
like I've done some slasher inversion things with books that I've written.
yeah.
Super Slasher, for example, is sort of a like inversion of that, where it's, well, what if you're putting teens who are still going to make bad decisions in, but they have more abilities than your normal slasher villains? How does that kind of invert? And how does that allow you to explore other things?
Yeah. And definitely for anybody watching who's trying to come up with their own horror story, I think a great place to like start is to like think about like your favorite tropes and stuff, but also think of how you can make it your own.
Mhm.
Because I think that's an important part. So even if there's a trope that one of us says is overdone, I'm also a firm believer that like you can make any trope good depending on how you execute it. It's really all about the execution.
Hmm.
Um,
Or not even just thinking of it as necessarily a box of things to tick off, but just like, it's a scenario. If you're putting different characters in, you can have them react differently and see how that affects the story.
yes, absolutely, absolutely. Um, so moving on from tropes, I want to talk about one of the most iconic parts of any horror story, which are the villains and the monsters. It can be very hard to write a compelling villain or create a compelling monster, but they're one of the core elements of horror stories. Almost every horror story has a villain. I won't say all of them do, because there are certainly times where you're more fighting like a supernatural force and they're not embodied by one specific character. But a lot of times there is an iconic villain. That's kind of what people most associate with the horror genre. Um, so I want to start with asking, what do you think makes a good villain? And if you have specific examples of horror villains that you like, feel free to name them.
I think iconography is one of the biggest things. Like, you did end up with a lot of characters who were essentially just, oh, well, it's a big person who you can't just take down. One of them has an inside out William Shatner mask, the other has a hockey mask, and like, that's kind of enough. You want to make something where you're going to have a recognizable character that also can kind of show what they do or what they are and kind of what they represent. So if you've got a big, bulky monster, it's going to be something that should be a unstoppable force. If you've got something that looks undead, what is that going to represent? How about you? Any thoughts?
I think iconography is a great thing to bring up, especially once again, if we're talking about applying this to comics, your character design is going to be really important, and you want to think of those things that are going to make your character design unique. And certainly things like iconic masks and weapons, things that we often associate with horror movie villains, are going to be great things to consider. But it doesn't just have to be a mask. Think of like other kinds of props or iconic pieces of clothing that your character can have that shows they are a distinct person. Actually, my favorite horror villain of all time is probably Rose the Hat from Doctor Sleep. And her iconic thing, of course, is she's called Rose the Hat because she wears a top hat and it looks super cool. So even like something like that of like a cool hat can make a character really stand out. But let's also talk about like writing the character, right? Kind of like building their personality. Um, I certainly think that an important thing about villains is making sure they have a good backstory and that you understand their motivations. You don't necessarily have to give away the entire backstory. Of course, like with a genre like horror, people often like there to be an element of mystery and suspense in there. So you don't have to give your readers the entire backstory, but you, as the creator, should have thought through the backstory and understand how that informs who they are today.
Well, or I might argue you don't even need to think about the backstory if the monster isn't necessarily what your story is about. If it's going to be something that it's a very character driven piece, or like we kind of mentioned, if it is more of a supernatural force that can't be stopped, I think that's a situation where you're going to want to make sure that the themes of the story are going to be like able to come through. But you can literally just have, oh, this guy wants to go and murder these people for this basic reason. And the simpler the reason, the kind of like less explanation that you need for it to be able to respond and do what it does. If you have an unstoppable force, it doesn't need to outthink your characters. It does not need to set up traps. But if you are going to go for the thinking villain, you kind of need to think about what they're going to do against your characters.
That's an interesting point to bring up. I do think one of the things that makes horror distinct, especially compared to like genres that are often mixed up with horror, like maybe mysteries and thrillers, because those can also have elements of like suspense and fear in them. To me, what makes horror stand out is the fact that it often has these like larger than life villains, and they're often battling against forces that are like big forces of nature. Like often the villain that they're going against represents evil itself. I mean, I already talked about earlier how I love having like monsters and stuff that are clearly representations of something bigger than that, because I think that's what makes horror kind of special. And so you're right, like your villain doesn't necessarily have to be super grounded in reality, because horror is the kind of genre where you can play with having a larger than life villain who is supernaturally powerful, which can be interesting to explore.
I do also think you made me think about something. Back in 2017, Universal tried to do their like new horror Avengers things with their Mummy movie with Tom Cruise. I don't know if you're familiar
Yes.
with that. And like part of the reason why it didn't work is there wasn't a sense of mystery. There wasn't a sense of not knowing things. There wasn't really a sense of horror. It tried to be like, oh, well, we're going to have all these military guys. We're going to have people who are too prepared for what's going on, who know what's going on. And it kind of leads to the situation where, so it's not really horror anymore. It's just action with a mummy in it.
Yeah. And I do think like there's kind of a difference between um like monster horror and monster action movies. Like that's another thing that can kind of be mixed up with each other. But if you're really trying to go horror and if you're marketing it as horror, you have to make sure those other elements are there. I think part of what makes like the reason we're having discussions like this, and part of the reason it's important to really understand the genre you're working within, is so that you can market it to the correct audience. I actually think now might be a good time to go on a tangent about marketing, just because I know we have creators watching this who maybe run their own small presses like I do, or are indie creators. I know a lot of people maybe run their own Kickstarters or crowdfunders to publish their artwork. So in that case, you're doing your own marketing. So it's important that you're able to reach the right audience. And if you are marketing something as a horror fans are going to have certain expectations of you. I guess my question then would be, if you were publishing a horror comic and you wanted to make sure it hits the right audience, what kind of like marketing tips do you have?
I mean, I've found that if you know a good like cinematic touchstone for it, that's like an easy way to communicate that you not only know like about horror movies, but it gives them something to uh like understand. You could say like it's a folk horror like Midsommar, but it's set in the Wisconsin Dells. Like there, people know what they're going in, they know what's different, and you've got that sort of elevator pitch for it. And I think getting that elevator pitch and then kind of going in with their expectations is important. Or like recently at CXC, we had two queer horror books, and they were not as much horror as it was more of a like poetic and symbolic horror story. And I think that's a difference that we had to like make clear, because there's a lot of like crossover between like queer media fans and horror movie fans. And if you understand like what you have and who you're trying to sell to, as opposed to trying to sell to like everybody, I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, I think those were great tips. So it really comes down to like having a good elevator pitch and including good comparable titles. I think part of that too is understanding not just that you're working within the horror genre, but maybe also the subgenre you're working within. We've already mentioned a couple ones, because there's slashers, there's monster movies, there's psychological horror, maybe queer horror. And so like being able to also name a subgenre is good. I will add the caveat though that I know sometimes figuring out what subgenre you exactly work in can be hard, and sometimes you maybe have genre crossover. You're like, well, it's like a little bit sci-fi, a little bit horror, a little bit like there's also maybe like a queer romantic subplot or something. And it's like, well, how do I explain that? And I think that's actually part of where comparable titles come in. Because if you can't exactly like narrow down what your subgenre is, maybe you can at least say, oh, well, it's like Alien meets I Saw the TV Glow. Now I want to like see what that movie would be. We got an interesting question in the comments, so we'll look at this one next. Have you heard the argument that horror isn't actually a genre, but more like a flavor that you can apply to multiple other genres? Hence why mystery, action, and thrillers can all have elements. What do you think about that?
I think you can have like a horror tinged mystery or a horror tinged action film or thriller. And I think, yeah, there's ways that you can apply the tropes, like we said. Like, if you have a like supernatural killer, but the focus is on solving the mystery and not surviving, or not trying to get murdered, that's one thing. Or if you have a movie with monsters in it, but your heroes are here to kick ass and take some names, that's kind of the difference that you have there. I mean, you could also do a horror romance. Like, I'd say that's what Shape of Water would be in a way. How about you?
Yeah, so I actually have not heard this argument that horror isn't really a genre, it's more of a flavor. And if someone were to argue that with me, I would tell them no, it is a
Yeah.
distinct genre. Um, because yes, I kind of agree with the part that like mystery, action, thrillers, they can have these horror elements because certainly fear, which is at the core of horror, can appear in any kind of story. Like fear is just natural human emotion. It's going to appear in all sorts of things. And I think another thing that all these like different genres have in common is the element of suspense. Like, I think that's part of the reason people often confuse horror and thriller specifically is they're both very suspenseful and can have like those creepy elements and be very dark in tone. But I still think there are things that are different. Like if you tell me I'm going to watch a thriller movie versus watching a horror movie, I'm expecting to get different things out of it. You know?
Yeah. Like the thriller part of it is these characters are likely going to survive what they are going through unless it's a horror thriller. Like it's you are along for the ride as opposed to you are being hunted down.
That can be true in some cases. I will say there are some thrillers that almost function like slashers where people are being killed off along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I still think like it doesn't follow a lot of the horror tropes that we already talked about. Like a lot of times the murderer is just a murderer. Like they don't necessarily have that larger than life aspect that we said that a lot of horror villains have. And I also think the pacing is different.
Yeah.
Um, Oh, we
Like,
got a follow-up question that I think is
oh.
really good, and I'm going to go ahead and pop that up. If horror is a genre, is thriller not a subgenre of horror? That's kind of what we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm.
There is a lot of genre crossover here, which can be confusing, which is why I said earlier, if like you're marketing a story and you're like not exactly sure what genre or subgenre it falls in, it's okay to like use a comparable title that you think is similar instead of like giving it a specific subgenre label because labels could get confusing. But I will tell you that as like a horror and thriller fan myself, and also as someone who knows a lot of other like voracious horror thriller readers, there are some people who think there's a big difference. And like if you tell me that I am getting a thriller and then it's not actually that, I'm gonna be mad, you know?
Well,
Like
what would you define as a thriller?
Well, I think what makes a thriller is kind of in the name. Like it needs to be something that's going to carry me on a thrill ride throughout the entire story. They are often very fast paced. They have an element of suspense that kind of like drives you through the whole story. Usually there are very high stakes, which like leads to the fast pace, right? Because it's like, oh no, a murderer is after me or some other kind of criminal. There's also certain tropes that are very typical of the thriller genre that you wouldn't see so much in horror, like the unreliable narrator or the like witness to a crime who's kind of like the main character often. Um, and so it's just kind of like the things that kind of drive the story are different, and the pacing is certainly very different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think a really good example to maybe help illustrate this is there's a book called When No One Is Watching by Alyssa Cole that was marketed as a thriller. And this made a lot of people very upset because a lot of people who read it then left reviews like, this isn't a thriller. This is a horror novel. It should have been marketed as a horror. But the thing is, everything about the marketing, I mean, it literally said like a thriller on the cover. And the cover even looked like you're like very generic, like horror, I mean, not horror, like thriller covers where it's like a picture of a house in like a dark neighborhood, you know? But the thing is, if you actually like read the story and see how it's paced and how it plays out, it very much feels like a horror. because horror usually has like a slower build than thriller does, with a big explosive ending. It very much had that like larger than life villain thing going on for it too.
Mhm.
And just like with the way the story plays out and the tropes that it plays on, I think it would have been much more successful if they had marketed it as a horror, because people didn't get what they were expecting with that genre label on it.
Fair.
All right. So I know that was kind of a bit of a tangent, but like I said, I know that it's something that I kind of feel passionate about, because if I get something labeled as a horror, I want that horror. I want that scary good stuff.
Mhm.
um But I did kind of briefly mention that covers can also play into how you market your story. And that's something I want to bring up, because a lot of people here watching are artists themselves and will actually be able to create their own cover. So let's talk about like what makes a good horror cover.
Skulls and lots of them. I mean, you do want to, if you have iconography, include that. Like the Nice House on the Lake and that whole franchise is very rooted in this very moody and evocative, spooky, like imagery, as well as kind of like runic symbols, which I have not read the series. I am kind of a horror coward, which makes me a great horror writer because I'm really easy to scare myself. Um, but like you want to give at least hints that there is going to be something scary going on, showing characters interacting with the monster or showing characters unaware that the monster is there for them. I mean, those are some pretty easy ways. How about you?
Yeah, I think like paying attention to that iconography is good. Like if you know there are symbols that are going to be throughout your story, using those in the cover design. I also think it's generally a good idea too, not to make sure your cover isn't too cluttered. Like I think regardless of whether you're talking about like comics or traditionally published novels or even like horror movie posters, I feel like the ones that are always the most eye-catching are usually very simple and focus on like one iconic image from the story.
Mhm.
Um, I
You,
also think colors can make a huge deal, right? Because they help set the mood and can kind of allude to the fact that this is going to be a darker story. Um, with horror, you can also often use colors that are not necessarily true to life. Like a lot of times things will kind of be doused in like red lighting, because then of course it kind of alludes to violence and blood and anger. And so kind of using color and lighting to your advantage can help set the tone as well.
yeah. And I think kind of try and make things clear that you are like leading into a horror story. Not to bring up my own work, but I am going to bring up my own work. I've got Sin Boldly, which is a comic that I wrote. And it's one of those things where I keep forgetting that there's a giant eyeball in the guy's mouth here. And it's one of those things where, like, if you've got it covered up like it is here, it doesn't quite look like a horror comic. And just maybe doing some red on the back might have made that clearer as a, like, oh, here's something that I thought about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think though an eyeball in the mouth though is certainly creepy and eye-catching. You're kind of right. Like maybe there were other things you could do to make it more obvious that it's horror, but I do think that's like a really interesting touch.
Yep.
All right, so we got another question here that I think is very important, which is how does horror in comics work differently than horror in other media? Because of course I've alluded to other media like novels and movies, and I do think those things are good to study too if you want to be any kind of horror writer. Like if you're making horror comics, um, even doing things like watching horror movies, even though it doesn't translate one-to-one to comics, is still going to help you understand the genre more.
Mm-hmm.
But there is kind of like one particular thing, well, maybe more than one particular thing, but the place where I want to start with what makes comics especially different is the pacing, right? Because I kind of already talked about how pacing in horror usually works. It usually has a bit of a slower build, slowly getting like creepier and creepier. It usually builds to a very explosive ending. Depending on what kind of horror, there might be like a big murder at the end or some sort of like violent thing where like maybe the main character is finally having their face-to-face confrontation with the villain. Or like some horror do have an element of mystery in them. So maybe it's like you finally finding out what exactly is going on in this big explosive ending. But I do think pacing in comics works very differently because of how it is with you having different panels, different panel sizes. And you also have to pay attention to where the page turns are. And you also have to pay attention to like what kind of horror are you actually making? Is it more of like a slow burn suspense, or do you want to throw in a few jump scares? So Luke, do you have any specific tips for pacing out your story?
I mean, one thing I'd say that you kind of need to consider when doing this is with a horror film or a horror story, you have the creator has a lot more control over how things work. Like you can pause the movie and then resume it when you want to, but with a horror comic, if your audience starts to get scared, they may stop looking at a panel and may take a break and come back like 5 hours later, and it's like all the images are laid out there. And I think that's like one of the things to consider. It's that what needs to be scary needs to kind of like remain there and remain strong, even if all of the tension goes out of the scenario as a result of the reader needing a break or what. And I also kind of think this is not entirely on topic, but like designing something to scare needs to be considered a lot more, because in a horror film, you only need to hint at something because it's only going to exist for like an instant on a scene. Or in a novel, you can describe a monster and your audience is going to complete that monster in their mind and it gets to exist. But with a comic, especially, again, because of the panel situation, if your monster is supposed to be scary and it's not really working out there, you're kind of out of luck. You kind of have to like assess that situation and figure out how to do that, which may be making your art more representational as opposed to needing to be so literal. There was a, are we allowed to swear on the stream?
You know, that's a good question that I'm not sure of the answer to.
There was a comic graphic novel that Alex DeCampi put out with Erica Henderson called Dracula Mother Bleed. And there, like Erica Henderson does some amazing work making it a lot more of a representational and strange horror. That and the other book they collaborated on, Parasocial, are kind of just like amazing American horror comics. How about you, AJ?
Yeah, well, I kind of want to first follow up with what you were talking about of like the challenge of actually illustrating something that's scary can be very hard. And so the tip that I want to give to viewers out there is it's just as much about what you show as it is about what you don't show. Like a lot of times hiding the scariest elements can actually be very effective because people can fill in the gaps in their brain. And one of the greatest pieces of writing advice I've ever, like, especially about horror that I've ever been given is nothing that you write or create will ever be as scary as what other people will create in their minds. So like leaving some things purposefully unknown so that the reader has to fill in the gaps in their mind is actually going to make it even scarier because people's minds tend to go to dark places. So like it will, if you done your job, it will work. It will be scary. And if you're not sure if you've done your job, the best way to practice is to show your artwork or your writing to your peers and get some feedback on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I do also kind of want to jump back to what we were talking about like pacing your comic, because it does work differently when you're working with a static medium that is on the page. And you're right, people's eyes can just kind of like linger. You actually have very limited control in your pacing when you're a comic artist, because the reader gets to decide when they turn the page, and they can look at that page or panel for as long as they want. What you can control is your panel size, which I think is very important. I'm going to bring up horror creator Junji Ito again. I'm going to put the name on the screen, but I'm not going to show any of his artwork because some of it is very disturbing. So while I would recommend this horror creator, after all, like, do be aware he does a lot of body horror. So like explore at your own risk. But here's his name if you're interested in looking up his artwork. I bring up Junji Ito in particular because I recently saw a review of the TV show Uzumaki, which was adapted from Junji Ito's graphic novel of the same name, that I thought was very interesting, because the reviewer pointed out that it doesn't seem to work as an anime because you no longer get to linger over his artwork the way you get to when it's a manga. Like, what makes his artwork so good and so like creepy is it's so like intricate, and it's just like a car crash that you can't look away from. Like, it's so creepy and weird, but like you want to like just stare at it and take it all in, because it there is a beauty to his artwork, even though it's very disturbing. So I think like having those moments of like big panels with your like creepy reveals can be very effective, because it allows your readers to just like take in all of the weird, gross stuff that might be in your horror story.
Kind of similarly, for those sorts of spooky like artists who kind of just linger with you, I remember one of the first comics that really just freaked me out solely because of the artwork was Richard Corbin's work on Hellboy the Crooked Man, because he has this similarly very textural style. Overall, it's a lot more, I'd say, stylistic than Junji Ito's, which is not stereotypically manga style in a negative way, but just like Corbin's work just has this texture to it that draws you in with the unnaturalness, and especially the Crooked Man's story that he illustrated with Mike Mignola. Just it squicks me out. It's like, I want to know how this ends, but I don't want to see what's going to be on this next page.
You actually reminded me of another horror comic that I would recommend. So it's called The Department of Truth, and I had to look up who the creators were. But it's written by James Tynion IV, who is actually a very popular horror comic creator. So definitely someone I would look into. But what I really want to shout out is the artist Martin Simmons, because his artwork would be another one to look into if you just like want to see an artist that has like a really unique, creepy art style. The art in it is so fascinating to me. It's just like one of those things that is like unlike anything else I've ever seen, but is very effective in the kind of story that it is, because it is meant to be like a creepy story. So yeah, I would recommend that one as well.
Yeah, I think like horror comics especially are one of those places where if you have a very distinctive style, you like figuring out what unsettles people about it is where you get to like find that horror.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely like get feedback from other people about like what's working, what's not working. Are there any elements of your style that you can push further to even like lean more into that unsettling, creepy territory if that's what you're going for.
Mm-hmm.
I think horror art, even if we're not talking about comics, but just horror art in general can be so fascinating because it is kind of interesting to kind of think about like what makes this like so scary to me. Like it's just a picture. It shouldn't actually be, like creating this visceral response in me, but somehow it does. All right. On the subject of horror art, I kind of want to go back to like a bit of creature design since monsters and creepy supernatural beings do show up in horror a lot. So I think that's another artistic thing that we can give some advice on. What are your best tips for creature design?
Um, make something that people understand and then make one thing wrong. Like, uh, you build the expectation that it's like, oh, well, we have a cat here. Everyone knows how a cat works. Everyone knows what a cat does. But like in real life, as soon as that cat starts arching its back and scaring you, it's like, no, this is not what it should be doing. This is not good. It is turning into something wrong. Like doing that sort of inversion is a good way to make something that you can not only draw repeatedly, but like it works simple for that like visual representation and kind of the root of fear, which is this is not what I expect. This is bad.
Yeah, it definitely, that technique in particular can really kind of get on people's uncanny valley response, which actually we just had a comment that mentioned that. That's part of why people find clowns so creepy is because they look like human, but there's something just like a little bit off about them that often puts people off. And that's why clowns are another like trope that's used in horror a lot. And the same thing can go with creatures. A lot of creature designs are based on real life animals. And actually, that was going to be my big tip is like, look about things that do exist in the real world and kind of use that as your basis. Because, like, yeah, I might not be able to actually find a photo of a real werewolf to use as reference, but I can look at wolves, I can look at dogs, I can look at things that do exist in the real world and think, okay, now I take this real thing, how do I manipulate that?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be good for supernatural creatures. You could even take like elements of like multiple animals and kind of combine them together in weird ways. Um, Also, of course, just like look at what's been done before. Look at some of the most successful monster designs of all time and think, what do I like about this? Why does this work so well? And you can get some inspiration from that as well.
Mm-hmm.
A specific comic or manga in this case that I will shout out here is Death Note, which falls more in the mystery genre, in my opinion, than horror, but I bring it up because it has really good monster designs because the story involves the Japanese gods of death, the Shinigami, and their creature designs are some of the coolest creature designs I've seen in any comic ever. So I would definitely check out the art of Death Note if you're interested in some cool creature designs.
Yeah. Also, if I were going to toss in something, I Hate This Place by Kyle Starks with Artyom Toplin is another kind of great comic to check out for horror because it is a mix of there's ghosts, there's undead, there's aliens, there are like sort of fake creatures. It's kind of all horror happening at one farm. And also, there's a guy trying to get money that he stole, and a couple caught in between all of that. It is one of my favorite horror books.
Oh, awesome. All right. So now I want to get to a couple of questions that were sent in the C3 Discord beforehand. If there's anyone in the audience who is not yet a part of the C3 Discord, feel free to reach out to us on social media and we can invite you. And that's a great way for you to get your questions to us beforehand and maybe even give suggestions for future live streams you'd like to see. But the first question we got in the Discord is, what do you think makes a good horror comic? Which is a pretty general question, so feel free to take it in whatever direction you'd like.
That the comic is done and complete and is not just an idea.
That's a good
I
answer.
mean, inherently, like, if you've completed a comic, it's a good comic. Is it a great comic? Well, that's another question. But I'd be looking for a clear sense of purpose for what you are trying to tell and why you are trying to tell the story that you are. Because we kind of talked earlier about, like, you can just toss zombies or whatever into a story and it doesn't necessarily work. But if you understand why you're using what you're using, that's a big part of horror.
Yeah. So my answer to this question is going to kind of specifically be about serialized comics versus stories that are contained within a single graphic novel. I feel like most of the horror comics I read are serialized. So I think one of the things that's most important is a good horror comic's going to get me to like read it, to go to the next chapter, go to the next issue. I think in particular, if you're writing the first issue of a horror, actually, really this applies to like the first issue of any comic.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to end on like a great first impression. Like you got to give me something at the end of that first issue that is like, oh, I have to know what happens next. Because one issue is not a lot of time to really grab a reader. A lot of that first issue is going to be set up, but if you can end it on a really good note of like, oh wow, that was like weird, I got to know what that's about. That's going to get people to keep reading. And then you got to try to also like keep that momentum, keep the suspense going so that your readers come back month after month or however often you like put out a new chapter or anything, and make sure they keep coming back.
If I could also add, alternately, if you are doing a graphic novel, you need to show horror. Like, just do the opening scene. Like, think about the Scream movies where you get that, like, always memorable first kill where it's worse than anything else is going to be in terms of gore and violence in the rest of the movie, because you've set a bar. You don't need to jump over that bar again. But that is going to be how you get people to be like, oh, damn. Okay, I got to see if anything else bigger happens. And
yeah. If I'm going to take it even further, I would say like your first page or even your first panel, if you can manage it, needs to be able to set the tone for your whole story. And I know that sounds very overwhelming. This is a piece of advice I got from the book Save the Cat, which is a screenwriting book. So this was specifically about movies. But the author really pointed out making sure that like your movie has a good opening image and ending image. But I actually think the same thing applies to comics really well, is you got to be able to grab that reader right from when they first open the book. So having a good like opening image or opening first page where the artwork is really eye-catching and is going to grab people in and also like set the tone for the story that's going to come, that's going to be a real game changer.
yes.
All right. The second question we got on Discord is, who is your favorite indie horror comic creator?
Do you want to go first? I feel like I've been going first all the time. So.
Well, I am kind of like directing the questions towards you, but I don't mind going first. So maybe this is going to show like a gap in my horror knowledge, because this person specifically asked for indie horror creators. And I do generally love picking up indie comics, but I feel like I don't pick up a lot of indie horror comics. So the best answer I can give you is actually someone who started off as an indie creator, but then was picked up by Webtoon. And that would be Mike Burchell, who is the creator of Everything is Fine, which was a comic I was going to bring up regardless of whether or not this person brought up this question, because it's literally my favorite horror comic of all time. If not my favorite comic, just in general, like it's that good. Please read it. And it is on Webtoon, so it is free to read. Please look up Everything is Fine by Mike Burchell. It will change your life. That's my recommendation.
I'm going to mention Kyle Starks again. He does a lot of genres of comics. He also writes and draws some of his own books. But I Hate This Place was great. Where Monsters Lie is his book about a gated community for serial killers that gets invaded. He did a amazing Mars Attacks miniseries with Chris Schweitzer. He wrote and drew Old Head, which is about a retired basketball player going up against Dracula. And that one's more of a comedy, but like Kyle Starks, if you are unfamiliar, check him. He also did the Dead of Winter comic adaptation from like the board game, and that was also really good.
Awesome. Well, before we start to actually wrap this up, I would like to ask one more time. I know because like each of us have brought up multiple comics and comic creators throughout this, but I kind of want to ask one more time if there's any other horror recommendations that you haven't mentioned yet that you would like to recommend to our viewers. What would they be?
I mean, I'd toss out just kind of the basics. Hellboy by Mike Mignola, and also the BPRD. The Hell on Earth stuff unsettled me so many times. The Sixth Gun by Cullen Bunn and Brian Hurt, and also I believe Bill Crabtree, is sort of a cowboy horror fantasy series. And then if you haven't gone back to it, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, it's
Yeah.
yeah. There's stuff I don't want to think about for too long in that.
All right, those are some good ones. I actually already mentioned a lot of the things I was planning on mentioning, like Uzumaki by Junji Ito, Everything is Fine by Mike Burchell. But the last one that I want to shout out is another one that is available to read for free on Webtoon. And it's simply called 4-Panel Horror Comics. I would definitely recommend this if you're interested in short form horror, because as the title implies, each chapter is just a little 4-panel horror comic. But part of what makes this series so genius is it starts as a bunch of seemingly unconnected 4-panel horror comics. But as you go on, you realize there is something that connects them all, and it is done in a very clever way. So I would definitely recommend that one as well. All right. And then to just also wrap things up, I wanted to mention to our viewers that fittingly enough, this October, the C3 Book Club is also reading a horror manga, and our discussion on it is actually this Wednesday, October 30th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time in our Discord. The book that we're reading is Frankenstein by Junji Ito. So it does contain his retelling of the Mary Shelley Frankenstein classic. But it also is actually a collection. Like it has his retelling of Frankenstein and then some other horror short stories at the end of it. So you'll also get some new content from that one. And if you can't finish reading that by the discussion on the 30th, since that's only 2 days away, I also want to let our viewers know we're going to be doing a live stream discussion of that book on November 13th. So if you check out the live stream, you can also get our thoughts on that book specifically, and that will certainly be a great discussion about another horror classic. So then, to wrap things up, Luke, is there anywhere we can find you? Any kind of last announcements you want to make?
You can find me on coltreg.bluesky.com, or you can find a bunch of my comics at coltreg.itch.io.
Awesome. And once again, I am AJ Easterday. You can find me at AJ Easterday 8, mainly on Instagram, but I also use Tumblr, and I actually recently got back on X, mainly for like promotional reasons. So I'm not
Yeah.
super active on that one. Would definitely recommend checking me out on Instagram. But you'll find all of my projects there. I'm currently working on an anthology about Norse mythology. So if you want to check out all the updates on that, if you're interested in Norse mythology, hit me up. All right. Well, thank you again to all of our viewers who tuned in for this discussion. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something about it. If you have any questions or any suggestions for future live streams, feel free to reach out to us on any of the Columbus Cartoon Coalition social media pages. Goodbye, everyone. Good night. Did it end?
No, it still says we're live. It's the stream that won't end.
I'm pressing the button, I swear.
Yeah.
All right. And now we are officially ending, I think. Goodbye, everyone.